Well, thank you all so much for being here. Welcome to our next online event at the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program. We are going to have a great conversation with Heather Browning and Oscar Horta today. And so, just to welcome everybody and give you a sense of what to expect, my name is Jeff Sebo. Along with my colleague Becca Franks, I direct the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program. This is a research and outreach and field building program that examines what wild animals are like, how humans and wild animals interact, and how we can improve our interactions with wild animals at scale. And we do that through producing research, hosting events, bringing scholars together to discuss their research priorities. And if you have interest in our work, you can check out our website. You can also sign up for our email list and stay in the loop about future events like this one. In this case, we are going to have a great conversation with two leading scholars who are addressing one of the foundational, important, difficult questions of this field, which is whether wild animal welfare is mostly positive or mostly negative. This is a very contentious topic, both because the science is very difficult and because the ethical implications are potentially fraught. And so it helps to think about it very, very carefully. So what we will do is after I introduce our two speakers, we will hear brief presentations from each of them, about 15 minutes or so each, give or take. And then that will leave approximately half of the session, maybe a little bit less, for open-ended conversation where we can be bringing in questions and comments from people in the audience. So if you would like to ask questions, make comments, make objections, any contribution at all, feel free to do that at any time starting right now by entering your contribution in the Q&A tab on Zoom. Please do enter that on the Q&A tab as opposed to the chat. The Q&A is where we will be looking for your questions and comments and other contributions. You can also reply and upvote on the Q&A tab. And then I will present questions and comments to our panelists by curating the contributions that are made on that tab. So please do keep that in mind throughout the presentations. Okay, now with that said, I can introduce our speakers. We will first be hearing from Oscar Horta, an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Santiago de Compostela. He works on normative and applied problems in ethics with a focus on animals and has been involved in animal advocacy for more than 3 decades, including by being a founding member of the influential organization Animal Ethics. And then his remarks will be followed by remarks from Heather Browning, who is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Southampton. She specializes in animal welfare, sentience, and ethics, with particular interest in welfare measurement and wild animal welfare. Prior to her current position, she worked as a researcher in animal sentience and welfare at the London School of Economics as part of the Foundations of Animal Sentience project. Alongside her academic career, Browning has also worked as a zookeeper and animal welfare officer. So thank you both so much for being here. Really looking forward to getting to the bottom of this issue finally and solving once and for all the question whether wild animal welfare is mostly positive or mostly negative. Oscar, we will start with you. So whenever you feel ready, feel free to share your screen and tell us a little bit about wild animal welfare.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me here. I mean, it's a great pleasure. And I'll start by pointing out that there is a lot we agree on. So while this is a discussion where we are meant to highlight our differences, as I said, both Heather and I agree on a lot. Like, for instance, we agree that this issue is very uncertain. We don't know for sure. We are just making some informed guesses. And then we also agree on something very important, which is that we should help animals regardless of how this question may be answered. So that's important to bear in mind because there is a lot of ground that we won't cover here, but that may be more relevant for the case of for caring for wild animals than what we're going to speak here. Okay, so I start with a few pictures that maybe not that nice, but which nevertheless are not the most gruesome that you can find out there. And I'm not doing this because I like those pictures. I hate them, but just to illustrate that, unfortunately, there are a lot of reasons why animals suffer out there in the wild. Uh, they suffer due to hostile weather events and conditions, lack of food, water, and also they suffer due to accidents, things like natural disasters and so forth. And one of them, for instance, parasitism, can be extremely painful and can last throughout the whole life of an animal. And then there are other animals who live very, very short lives, and they die in very painful ways. Now, we don't know for sure if this means that suffering prevails or not, but there are some indicators about this that we should take into account. So to see this, we could take a look at what theoretical ecology tells us. We can look, for instance, at the basics of things like population dynamics, but we can also look at how this translates in practice. And what we find is that there are certain animal populations that reproduce by having a few offspring, and on average, their lives tend to be very long. So you can see here, if you consider the survivors in this population, you see that's the beginning of their lives, and this is when death tends to happen. However, most animals are not like this. They are like this one. They reproduce by having very large numbers of offspring, and on average, they tend to die very young, right? So why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because they die prematurely, but in addition, it's relevant for two other reasons. The first one is that this is what happens in most animals. So the vast majority of animals fall into this. And the second one, to see it, I want to consider how suffering and positive well-being can be distributed in an animal's life. So, we don't know whether the baseline for animals is positive, negative, or neutral. So I'm going to conservatively here assume that on average, the life of an animal may be over the zero level, right? But it does happen that death is painful in many cases. Maybe not in most cases, but what we know for sure is that it is not pleasurable, meaning that on average, death is something bad. So we can count it as contributing to the animal's ill-being, right? So if we consider these two things, what we have is that those animals who die very, very early in life will have lives that contain very positive well-being because they didn't have time enough to enjoy more, but they contain the pain of the processes leading to their deaths. This is extremely simplistic, but it's just a heuristic to think about this. Whether this is the case or not for all animals, well, it's an open question. And for sure, it won't be the case for all animals. But on average, this may tend to be the case. Whereas for those who die, later in life, well, maybe their well-being outweighs, their positive well-being outweighs their suffering. Now, what happens is that we can think, well, if this is so, that could have important implications, but maybe animals at the beginning of their lives are not sentient. So that would mean that we would start to count later, right? So we would discount all those animals that die when they are very young. The problem with this, though, is that, well, there are two problems. First is that there are many animals who, it seems kind of strange to think that they're not sentient when they get out of their eggs. And then the other thing is that, if early non-sentience is taken seriously, so when animals get out of their eggs, they start to exist. If it's true that most of them are not sentient, what that means is that in the lives of all the animals, even those who live until a later age, there will be less positive well-being, assuming the framework I considered before. In addition, there is another implication of this, which is that if this is wrong, and what happens is that death, even for animals at the beginning of their lives, doesn't outweigh suffering, pleasure, then we could also consider the following, which is that if animals on the overall have good lives, then their premature deaths would be harming them because they will be depriving them of those positive lives. So overall, there will be a huge aggregate harm of death happening to the vast majority of the animals, right? So this is not conclusive at all. As I said, this is just a heuristic to think about this. But when we consider all this, it looks like the early death, premature death, could be considered something like a proxy for the presence of suffering. Meaning that since most animals die when they are very young, suffering may prevail in the wild. And if this is not the case, this value may anyway prevail because of the harm of death aggregated of all these animals. In addition to this, there is something else we can consider here. And to think about this, I want you to think of the following thought experiment. So suppose that next week, you're going to suffer one day the worst possible torture that you can imagine, maybe for several hours, maybe for the whole day. And then another day, we don't know which one, it may be before or after the other one, you'll experience the mildest possible pleasure. I don't know, maybe some smell that you like or something. And then suppose that you can change one of these. Well, one possibility would be to change the torture. And you can, trade it off for the mildest possible pain, maybe a very mild scratch or something, right? And the other possibility, though, would be to change not the torture, but the pleasure. You could have one day of the worst possible torture and one day of the best possible joy. Now, what's interesting here is that most people, I mean, the vast majority of the people, if not everyone, thinks that doing the former would be way better, right? No one or almost no one would choose to suffer the worst possible torture just for the sake of enjoying the best joy. So how can we explain this? Well, there are two possible explanations here. One is that what happens is that in axiological terms, there is an asymmetry. So negative things, suffering in particular, count for more. So maybe something that could count for the same, that the best joy would be maybe some bad pain, but not the worst torture, right? So that's one possible explanation. If we accept this, we are accepting an axiological asymmetry. And this would mean that even if suffering doesn't prevail in the wild, this value would prevail. Because even if the total aggregate suffering that there is out there is smaller than the overall aggregate pleasure or other positive things, the disvalue of the suffering would nevertheless be greater. So this is one explanation. But then there is another explanation, which is, no, it's not really that there is that axiological asymmetry. What happens is that our capacity to suffer is more significant than our capacity to experience pleasure. So that's why it's worse to suffer that terrible torture. So if we accept this, then, well, what happens then is that suffering would be much, much higher in scale than we would think if our capacities for pleasure and for suffering were the same. Because we have a more significant capacity for suffering, that means that we have reasons to believe that given that suffering and pleasure are what motivate us due to evolutionary reasons, and because suffering is more significant, there will be overall reasons to think that suffering is really more prevalent. So in either case, I mean, I'm happy to conclude either of these reasons. I'm uncertain about them. Maybe both of them apply, really. But this is important because maybe the most important question here would be whether this value prevails rather than whether suffering prevails, although it's not clear. It's not really clear whether the latter is true or not. And then there is another consideration to take here into account. So what we've seen before means that it's, it's reasonable to think that in animal populations, there are, unequal distributions of suffering and pleasure, and there are unequal distribution of overall well-being. By the way, this term well-being shows that we have an optimistic bias, because we use the term well-being or welfare to name both positive and negative welfare. Why not ill-fare to call both positive and negative? We would have the same reasons to choose any of the terms if we were neutral. So, this can hint us that maybe we are biased towards not considering the bad things that go on, and maybe this applies here. But anyway, going back to the issue, if we have these unequal distributions of value, and if we have a minority who may have great lives because they make it to maturity, on average, on stable population, maybe they can be a couple of them, one per parent, but the majority have these very bad lives, then maybe the distribution of well-being, of net well-being, could be as the one displayed there. And we would have reasons to think that, well, yeah, suffering does prevail. But maybe this is not so. Maybe, there is certainly more pleasure than suffering. However, it may well be the case, because of what we've seen before, that despite this, most animals have lives where suffering prevails, right? It just so happens that the lives of the ones who survive somehow compensate because, they live for so long. But this would be so in accordance to certain criteria, certain normative principles, like, for instance, those of totalism. But there are many views in axiology and in normative ethics according to which this wouldn't be so. Not only that, it may even be the case that the majority of animals have lives where pleasure prevails over suffering. But nevertheless, we would consider those scenarios bad scenarios, because it would nevertheless be really, really, really bad that there are so many animals, even if they are not the majority of them, that live very bad lives. So this is basically what I wanted to speak about. I just want to conclude making one point, which is all these questions, as I said, are extremely controversial, are extremely uncertain. We don't know for sure whether we should go in one direction or another. More research will provide a better understanding of this, but empirical research is not going, at least in the foreseeable future, to resolve this question. I think that until we solve the hard problem of consciousness, we won't be in a position really to solve these issues. So that would give us reasons, I believe, to act in a cautious way, because it looks like causing suffering, at least to many people, has something bad in it that would make it even worse, much worse maybe, than preventing some positive pleasure, some positive well-being from occurring. And this is something to take into account. And that will be it. Thank you very much, and I leave it here for Heather.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Oscar. So I think, yeah, as I'm getting started here, it's important to highlight one of the things Oscar said, which is that, there is a lot of agreement between our positions, which is that, there's still a lot of empirical uncertainty that requires more research to go through. And also the fact that regardless of what the status is, whether there's net suffering or net positive experience in the wild, we should be intervening to help wherever there is suffering. And, particularly if there are animals whose lives are, for them, net negative, it doesn't really matter from their point of view, whether they're one of a large group or whether, they're only a small group. It's still morally important to do something about it. And so certainly, what I'm saying here is not meant to be taken as a case against intervening to help out for animals in the wild. But I guess just more to highlight the range of considerations that go into boosting the case for thinking that there is a lot more positivity than some of the other accounts might put forward. So to begin with, Firstly, I just want to lay out when I'm talking about welfare, what I mean here. There are different ways of describing welfare, different definitions of welfare. Here, I'm using what I think is a pretty common view of welfare, particularly within animal welfare science, which is welfare as the affective state of the animal. So it's sort of its feelings, what the positive and negatively valenced mental states that it feels. So these can be just basic pleasures and pains, but also things, like hunger and joy and comfort. And we think that an animal has good welfare when it has mostly positive mental states, and poor welfare when those are mostly negative. So when we're talking about this kind of like net positive and net negative, I'm thinking about it in terms of these sources of pleasure and suffering, in terms of their felt experiences. Now, it's a lot of discussions on wild animal welfare do focus on the sources of suffering. So, there's a salient much more these little guys like these hippos here than the happy animals that might be living out in the wild. And, this isn't an unreasonable thing to have focused on, because it was in large part intended to sort of offset an idyllic view of nature that comes up a lot, I think, in common thought and within members of the public, this idea that a natural life is the best possible life for an animal. I'm someone who worked in zoos, and certainly the opposition to zoos often seems to come from this sort of view that there's something about the wild which is just, so good for animal welfare that you wouldn't want to take it away from them. And so I think, pushing back against that is a good thing. But, we do see cases now where it seems to have gone too far the other way, and particularly some people advocating for perhaps quite extreme conclusions based on the idea that they think that suffering prevails in nature. So, pushing back on that, I guess I want to give some reasons to think, well, look, things aren't as bad as all of that, and, perhaps we want to avoid some of these more extreme actions. So just to outline, I'll briefly go over some of the sort of sources of negative welfare that have been discussed and why they may not be quite as bad as we think, and then highlight the sources of positive welfare, and then just talk a tiny bit about the importance of doing these welfare assessments in the wild. So firstly, the sources of negative welfare. So, pretty much when you're thinking of the types of suffering that wild animals can experience, there's the suffering during their deaths and the suffering during their lives. And, I think that maybe both are less severe than the common picture can assume. So, firstly, thinking about bad deaths. So Oscar did these really nice little graphs here where, it had the sort of the value of the welfare of a life and then the disvalue of death. And certainly, in almost all cases, the death is going to have a negative. It's an ill-being experience. But I guess the question is, how thick is that little red chunk there, and how disvaluable is the death versus the life? Because certainly when we think about deaths, we think of them as being, like quite violent and painful and really quite bad for the animal. But perhaps this isn't true as often as we imagine it to be. So, in many cases, deaths are not prolonged. So most deaths by predation are extremely quick. They can be in seconds to minutes. And even discussions where people talk about, the most extreme cases, they're talking about cases that are something like 15 minutes out of a lifetime. So many animals are killed very quickly, relative to the length of life. For many animals, again, this isn't going to be too long. Even if we think about animals that only live a few days, if their death is just a few seconds of being taken and consumed by a predator before they lose consciousness and lose their life, still not very long compared to the length of their life. And typically we're going to see that deaths that have a sort of longer duration, so say an illness or a hunger-based death, isn't going to have as high of intensity of negative experience as the sort of pain of something like a predation death. So we might think that kind of disvalue of death is going to be a little bit less than is assumed. And one of the reasons in favor of this is thinking about shock-induced analgesia, which comes up. Humans report this, that, often when they suffer severe injuries during times of high tension, such as in war, the pain does not onset until sort of after the event and after it is cleared. And it makes sense if we think that the function of pain is something like triggering avoidance and recovery. Those things are not good when you're trying to defend and escape from, say, a predator. So it makes sense not to be feeling really bad in those moments. And we do see that, fear and stress responses will actually inhibit the feeling of pain because they produce endogenous analgesics, which essentially act as painkillers in the moment. So we might think that a lot of predation deaths actually don't involve as much pain as you would think they would just by looking at the types of injuries that are brought on. So perhaps these deaths aren't creating as much disvalue as we think they would. So, what we need to understand here is what is the intensity and the duration of different modes of dying. I think in many cases, they're unlikely to be a major deciding factor in lifetime welfare, depending again on the length of life of the animal and the type of death. But we do have this kind of salience bias for thinking about extreme events. So, Oscar tried to say that we might have this sort of salience bias for like positive things, because we talk about welfare. But I think certainly when we look at, the way we do our media and the news and the way that we sort of negative events stick in our minds, there is a certain salience to more extreme things that perhaps lead us to overvalue them. There is this additional question regarding the sort of badness and disvalue of premature death itself that Oscar mentioned as well. This is a separate thing, obviously, than whether a life is net positive or net negative, but we might think that premature deaths are a major source of disvalue, particularly if animals have good lives. And so that's something that we should be paying attention to separately from this question. On the question of bad lives, certainly we can point to lots and lots of negative things that wild animals experience: predations, droughts, fires, starvation. All of these things happen on a fairly regular basis. But the big question is, are these things happening with sufficient intensity and duration to outweigh the other kinds of things that are happening? And so, we want to think, firstly, how bad are these negative experiences? How intense is the negative affect that an animal has at this time? So, for example, people often talk about fear and the fact that prey animals must live in this constant sense of fear. So the landscape of fear theorizing shows that animals that are in an environment with predators, such as deer, they do show completely different ecology. They stick to the trees, they don't go out into open spaces, and this is called fear ecology. But there's no evidence here that that's actually driven by a felt sense of fear in this sort of negative affective way. It's just a behavioral change that's modulated by perhaps caution. And if we think that ongoing stress is actually really bad for organisms, it's bad for your immune systems, bad for your reproductive capacity, it seems unlikely that animals that have evolved to live in these kinds of environments long term are going to have an ongoing felt negative affect. So what we really need to establish is whether these behavioral changes are because of a negative feeling or if they're driven by something else. So if we're thinking about what the quality of lives are, really we need to be weighing up the sources of negative versus the sources of positive welfare. So, as well as all these negative experiences we can think of, there are lots and lots of sources of pleasure and positive welfare experiences that we need to pay attention to. So we've got this little snow one here is a bird using a piece of plastic to essentially sled down a snowy roof. So it's playing, we've got social interactions, we've got parental care, all of which might be positively affectively valenced for these animals. And it makes sense when we think about the evolution of affect. Why is it that we have these positive and negative feelings at all? Very likely to play motivational and decision-making roles for animals, so that negative affects promote avoidance and positive affects reward useful behaviors. But importantly, that means that, in terms of a lot of behavioral and bodily needs, we're going to end up seeing something like a symmetry there, so that negative affects are going to have a counterbalancing positive affect once that need is met. So, we might have a hungry tortoise, he feels bad, hunger is a negative affect, but then he gets something to eat and all the pleasures associated with food processing and satiety are then available to him. We have thermal discomfort when cold, but thermal comforts, and those are positive feelings when you are able to warm up. So if we think that, the meeting of bodily needs is positively valenced in the same way that unmet needs are negatively valenced, we're going to see a rough balancing over time for animals that are able to meet their needs. We can also see other sources of pleasure in a lot of the natural behaviors that animals perform. Many of these natural behaviors do seem to be rewarding for wild animals. So a study a few years back suggested that birds find singing intrinsically pleasurable. So it actually, the hormones that we see released in their brain are actually those associated with pleasurable experiences. So it seems like birds sing because they actually like to. And that may be true of a whole different range of behaviors that we see animals doing. Also, exploration and investigation of the world, also likely to be positively valenced experiences and very, very common parts of animal lives. So they spend, quite a bit of time when they're not actively sort of eating or sheltering, exploring their worlds, looking for sources of food, looking for new resources, and learning things about their environments. And Pansip, when he laid out what he thought of some of the core emotions that animals shared, he called this the seeking system, and it was considered to be one of the positively valenced feelings that's common to almost all animals. And we do see, a lot of animals will actively spend time trying to explore their world, investigate novel objects, and learn more about the environment around them. And we might think that perceptual experiences could be pleasurable as well. So, for ourselves, certainly we can see, hear, smell, taste things that we find, positive or negative. And it may be true for other animals too. So I put a little picture here of a wombat at the sunset. This is just because there's some sort of folklore within zoos that wombats like seeing the sunrise and the sunset. Now, I have no idea whether or not that's true, but it's possible. It may be the case that certain kinds of visual experiences or other kinds of perceptual experiences could be pleasurable for animals as well. And again, these may be low level, but they're very, very common, which means that they might provide that kind of boost. The experience of agency, exercising agency, making choices and having control over the outcomes in your environment may also be a source of pleasure. This is something that animal welfare science is paying a lot of attention to now, agency, choice and control, how that impacts animal welfare. And we certainly see animals showing a preference for exercising their agency when they're given the choice that appears to be associated with positive welfare experience. So, there's a zoos here giving elephants buttons that they can use to activate showers. So they don't have to wait for a keeper to do that. Here we've got some giraffes that have access to a feeder that's a sort of more complex feeder to get their food out of. And research has shown that even if pieces of those food are placed just directly on top of the feeder where they could access it for free, they'll take the effort to go in and use this cognitive sort of challenging feeder. So it seems to be that exercising their agency to get the food this way and this kind of challenge is something that's a positive experience for them, which might be linked to something like the evolutionary benefits of acting. If it's positively valenced to go out and make decisions and choose to act, then that might just motivate more fitness maximizing actions. And I think typically wild animal lives should hold lots of opportunities for them to exercise their agency, which means this is a source of pleasure they're likely to encounter quite frequently. And then finally, there's something that we call the sort of baseline joy of living, which might be just this sort of baseline positive affect that in the absence of any sort of particular negative or positive experience, that the experience of life itself is just slightly positively valenced. And certainly this seems to be the case in humans. We see globally that life satisfaction and human well-being surveys have people reporting a net positive experience, even when their lives seem to be objectively from the outside quite bad, with lots of sources of negative affect. This sort of baseline, this positive baseline, appears to be very widespread amongst humans, and it's argued that this could be adaptive, that having this kind of positive baseline mood, when you're in a positive mood state, it motivates certain kinds of behaviors, certain kinds of social interactions that may be adaptive. And if the same benefits are true for other animals, then we might expect to see in them this kind of baseline positive affect in the absence of any particular negative experience as well. All right, so I've just given a whole lot of reasons here, to think that we could maybe boost up the plus column when we're thinking about the negative versus positive in the wild animal lives. But at the end of the day, we can't just sort of do this from the armchair. It's all well and good to sort of talk about, well, hey, here are some good things, here are some bad things, here are some models to think about one or the other. But really what we need to be doing is, if we want to think about what is the quality of an animal's life, we need to compare the relative intensities and durations of all the different positive and negative experiences that they have. So there's a little graph here where we can think about these sort of over time, different positives and negatives, how intense they are, how much they impact the animal, and what this is going to look like in total. And I think it's really very far from obvious in advance whether that balance is going to be positive, negative for any individual. I think it's very likely to vary based on species as well. And so what we need here is we need wild animal welfare research. We need to get out into the wild and actually assess what their welfare is like. What does this balance look like for different species, different individuals at different times, and what is impacting it? So it's a really important research program. It's still a very rare activity. Often when people are measuring what they refer to as welfare, they're really just measuring stress or body condition of the animal, not really directly tied to its overall affective state. Particularly, it misses out a lot of the sort of positive potential for it. And so developing and validating measures that relate to these affective states in animals, I think is a really important part of where we need to go next in answering these questions. And Oscar was skeptical about our ability to do this because of the hard problem of consciousness. I think animal welfare science has developed enough ways of making inferences to the best explanation and having sort of, reasonable measures that appear to track what we think of as affective state, that I think we can make quite a lot of progress, even if that kind of skepticism is still there in the background. But we do have to be careful that the measures that we use are ones that are valid and feasible to use in the field, because most measures of animal welfare have been developed in laboratory or captive settings. And so finding the right measures to use out in the wild is a really important part of this project too. And then sort of finally coming to this question of intervention, on any account, whether it's this more positive or negative one, there's still going to be a lot of wild animal suffering. And so, what should we do about this? Certainly we should be doing something and trying to help out. And that may involve examining our current and proposed actions and practices for how they impact wild animals. Thinking about, for instance, how industrial chicken farming is impacting a lot of wild birds right now because of the spread of bird flu. So we've got these human practices here impacting wild animals, causing lots of suffering that we can evaluate and perhaps stop. We can make policy recommendations for ongoing protection of wild animals and put out interventions to prevent any sources of suffering that we identify, and possibly, maybe a bit more optimistically, to promote the positive experiences of animals as well, if we're able to do that. So if we think about, what is a good life going to look like for a wild animal, it's going to be minimizing the sources of suffering from, unmet bodily needs, disease, injury, habitat loss, hunting and trapping, all these sorts of things, but also making sure that we maintain the opportunities for pleasure, that they're able to meet their bodily needs, that they can perform their natural behaviors, explore, exercise their agency. And we need to make sure that that balance is still there. So to conclude, wild animals have many sources of positive experience coming from all different aspects of their lives, meeting their bodily needs, natural behaviors, exploring. We need more research, empirical research, to identify what these sources of positive and negative wild animal welfare are and how they balance each other. Regardless of what this shows, we should be intervening wherever possible to decrease suffering and enhance opportunities for positive experiences. And then lastly, just I guess one other important thing that comes out of thinking about positive wild animal welfare is that when assessing the impact of interventions, we need to be counting both the positive and negative aspects of wild animal welfare. So it's not just enough to think about, does our intervention, cause or relieve suffering, but does it change the access different animals have to varieties of positive experience as well? Because that's going to be part of the overall impact of those interventions too. All right, thank you.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Oscar and Heather, for those initial talks. Obviously, a lot of overlap, possibly some disagreement, or at least different areas of emphasis. We have a lot of questions and comments coming in on the Q&A tab, and we can have plenty of time for those. But as a starting point, I wanted to give you each the opportunity to follow up on your initial remarks if you have any questions or comments or reactions to the other presentation. So Heather, I would love to give you the opportunity to ask any question or make any comment you may or may not have in mind about Oscar's presentation, and then vice versa, Oscar with Heather's presentation. And no worries if nothing comes to mind. I just want to open by giving you the opportunity. Heather, is there anything that comes to mind on your end?
No, nothing. I think I mentioned a couple of things while I was giving my talk, so I'm not sure I've got anything above that at the moment.
Got it. Oscar?
Yeah, well, I guess I would just say that there is a lot that I agree on with Heather's presentation. So all the part about positive well-being, most of it at least, I totally agree with. I guess I'm a bit more skeptical about the baseline positive balance. It may be, but it's very uncertain. So I wouldn't really count that. I wouldn't give a lot of credence to that. Then something I would clarify is that I think that work on the development of wild animal welfare assessment methods really is very important, and getting that work done really is going to be extremely useful. Not really only for assessing this question, which is not really a priority. It's more like a foundational thing, but it's not really going to determine whether we should act in a certain way or another in most of the cases, or in many cases at least. But what I was gonna say, what I try to say is that this is not gonna solve the question. There is gonna always be some uncertainty there, because we are not in the minds of the animals, and because that happens, erring in the side of caution would lead us to try to avoid causing suffering. That would look to me as something more important than trying to promote or safeguard pleasure. For these reasons that I mentioned in my tables and all that. So I think that basically the strongest disagreement, or maybe the only disagreement at the end of the day, may be on the prevalence part. You know, how in those lines that Heather wrote and in my tables, what values we assign there, what probabilities we assign there.
Yeah, I think that's about right. And I think, one thing Oscar highlighted that I didn't bring up too much in my talk is the fact that this question is going to turn a very, very large amount on what the lives of short-lived, the so-called selected species are like, animals that produce a lot of offspring, many of which die young. Those are most of the animals out there. And the question of whether or not, their lives are kind of net positive and whether they're before their deaths and whether their deaths sort of outweigh this, that's going to be a big part. So, we think a lot about animals that are bigger and more visible to us, but they aren't most of the animals that are out there. And so, research should really be focusing on what these kind of little short-lived species are doing. And that's probably going to tell us a lot more. And I think also, the extra question about how we weight the disvalue of their deaths as well. So the early deaths for these animals, regardless of what their lives are like, is also going to play a big part there.
Great, thank you both. So a related question, though this one is perhaps more normative and less descriptive. So Heather and Oscar, you were just talking descriptively about whether there is a positive baseline affect, a baseline joy of living. The kind of normative complement to that is whether life in and of itself is a benefit or a gift. And one audience member asks, Heather, how much, if at all, does your argument presuppose the idea that mere existence, merely coming into existence, is a benefit or a gift, a kind of positive tick on the ledger? And then Oscar, we can also ask you the converse of that, which is how much does your argument depend on the idea that death is in and of itself a harm? You briefly mentioned the idea that death is a harm over and above the pain and suffering associated with dying. Death itself is a harm. How much does your argument depend on that more philosophical, ethical idea? Heather, we can start with you.
Yeah, good. So, I mean, I certainly don't think anything I say rests too much on that kind of presupposition. Insofar as I would say that, life is a benefit, coming to existence is a benefit. It's insofar as I think that that allows for the positive opportunities that it then contains. So it's more, I guess, coming into existence a prerequisite for any benefits at all, rather than itself being a benefit. But in cases where the life that is created, the existence that you come into is going to be a net negative one, I don't see that as being, in any way kind of offset by the fact that you got to exist versus not exist. So it's really all a question of what happens after, how good is the life that actually comes into existence, rather than the life itself having this kind of boost of value.
Oscar?
Yeah, so I think that the problem of the harm of death is one of the toughest one really in axiology. It's very, very difficult and how you quantify it and all that. But my argument really doesn't rest on that. So what I was saying actually was that if my argument was not right, which I hope, by the way, is not. I really hope that Heather is right, though I'm concerned that, if Heather is not right, but we all come to agree that she is right, and that could have bad consequences. However, I would love it if after this talk most people were convinced by Heather, because that would lead me to think, yeah, maybe that's the right view, because all these intelligent people believe this. I'm the one who is wrong. But if that's not the case, and if these intelligent people didn't get it right, that would be problematic. Anyway, so the point here is that if that's so, if my view is not correct, and if happiness prevails, then that consideration would have a much higher strength, because then the harm of death would be way more significant, right? So and it looks like many people have the intuition that there is something bad about death, right? So we try to avoid death, even if we by dying we were able to, I don't know, make it the case that some other being could come into existence. Most people don't buy the replacement argument. So yeah, that's everything I wanted to say with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I do wonder, this is maybe a brief follow-up just for me, if the harm of death is already captured by your argument without needing to be asserted separately, because often the harm of death is cashed out as a kind of deprivation of further happiness, right? What makes death harmful is that it deprives you of the ability to have future happiness or flourishing as the kind of being you are. And your argument already just notes that for beings who die very young, death forecloses that possibility for further happiness. You have just a little bit of happiness, then a painful death without then the opportunity for more happiness that could then outweigh the death. So maybe that already is factored into the argument that you laid out very early on in your presentation. Is that accurate, do you think?
That would be so if we agree with the replacement argument, but if we don't, then it wouldn't be captured by that.
Got it. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, great. So there are a lot of questions about the science, and then there are a lot of questions about the ethics. And so we might bounce back and forth a little bit. Here is a question, well, a little bit about both from Giselle. Shouldn't the more relevant question for intervention be what is the gap between their current welfare and their welfare under optimal care, even if an animal has a good life and we can drastically improve the life at not too great a cost? We have an obligation. If an animal has a bad life, presumably we can improve the life more. So a more general way of putting the point is, from a practical perspective, is the question not just always what can we do to improve animal welfare, whether the animal welfare is weakly positive or weakly negative or strongly negative. Our goal should always be to make it better. So why does it matter whether wild animal welfare is net positive or net negative for practical purposes? Or put differently, is there a situation in practice today where your decision making or like policy recommendation would hang on your assumption about the net positive or net negative state of wild animal welfare? Heather.
All right, good. So I think, I mean, you know, a lot of this just comes down to what your sort of preferred axiologies and ethical theories are. I think I have some leanings towards something, you know, along a negative utilitarian or a prioritarian line, which essentially looks at, you know, what we should be trying to remove the worst first before we're increasing the best cases, so that we have sort of much weightier reasons to remove a source of suffering than we do to boost a happy animal up to an even happier state. And that's not to say that there are no reasons. I absolutely agree that making happy animals happier is a good thing. Again, working in zoos, I see that as a large part of what we did there, that, you know, most of the animals that we're housing aren't suffering, but they could have even better lives. And so you're working to kind of push that up all the time. But yeah, I think in a case where we're looking at animals where we have very real and severe sources of suffering, that putting our resources into those first is probably going to be the best way to move forwards.
Oscar, anything to add?
Yeah, so yeah, I think I agree with Heather, and both of us stress really these situations that there is a lot to do that wouldn't be affected by whether you know, some animals have positive or net negative lives. Now, in the question, they were looking for a case where this may make a difference. There is something that I can think of that could be, I mean, maybe this wouldn't be like the key factor, but it could be a contributing factor, which is that in the case of a campaign like the screwworm free future one. So as you know, screwworms are these parasites that cause extreme suffering to the animals they feed on. They lay their eggs into the wounds of larger animals. And it looks to me like the suffering of the victims of this parasite is so huge that this campaign makes sense, and that we should promote it, even if overall the well-being of the parasites themselves were overall positive. However, the latter is uncertain. So it might be that if because these parasites, they lay hundreds of eggs, and only a few of them make it to maturity. So if these parasites don't have good lives, then this would add extra reasons in favor of this campaign, even though, as I said, I think that the campaign would stand even if this weren't the case.
Great, thank you. Now we have another ethical question, and this one comes from Devin. Devin notes that, Oscar, you lean on our intuitions with respect to this suffering happiness asymmetry, that we have the intuition that suffering is more important than happiness, and that the badness of suffering is more significant than the goodness of happiness. But Devin notes that many humans also have an intuition against pure aggregation. In other words, against the idea that a large number of small harms can be worse overall in the aggregate than a small number of large harms. And obviously, if we reject pure aggregation, then even a very large number of weakly bad lives or weakly negative lives might not outweigh the goodness of one very sort of long, happy life full of love and joy and so on and so forth. So yeah, would you like to speak to this question about how much depends on this aggregation assumption?
Okay, but maybe not just me. Maybe Heather wants to say something about that as well,
Sure,
and
sure.
I can start
Hmm.
if you want. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, first of all, it strikes me that as like the aggregationist view would be the one that would say that, yeah, this wonderful life compensates for the suffering of all these other individuals, the majority of them, right? That's something like an aggregationist approach would support. Now, but this being said, we should also take into account something else, which is that the worst lives that are out there are not the ones of the animals who die very young. They're actually the ones of those who live longer and live long lives, but have some sorts of suffering, of continuous suffering, some chronic pain because of an injury, or because they are parasites, they have parasites, eating them from within and so on. These animals can have excruciating pain during like months and years, many years, right? So the argument then would mean that preventing that suffering would be what has priority. And then I wouldn't say that my argument relies on the intuition that suffering just generally considered counts for more than pleasure. I just put a very concrete example, and I said that how we interpret that example may be different. And that's one possible interpretation of the example. Another possible interpretation is that they count for the same, but it just so happens that we sentient beings have a higher capacity, empirically, something that we would empirically verify. Is not something theoretical, so for suffering.
Hmm. Are there anything to add?
Yeah, I guess just one thing is that to be careful to distinguish, I guess, just the questions about how we aggregate goodness and badness in terms of just felt experiences and positive and negative welfare versus the kind of how we aggregate the moral reasons to act, or something like that. So we might think that, look, we can make a case that, in nature, there is more suffering than there is pleasure. There is a net negative welfare, without saying that, the way that we act on that is going to be based on aggregation, without saying that our reasons to act are going to be in this sort of sense that, it's more important for us to reduce many small sufferings than it is for us just to reduce one big one.
Yeah, I will note that. So I am very open to the idea that a large number of small harms can outweigh a small number of large harms. I do think that aggregation makes sense as one factor among many in our assessments of the situation and decisions about what to do, but it is not the only factor in my view, and it is not a factor from which we can directly derive a recommendation for action. And in particular, there are going to be further considerations about agency and autonomy and rights, and about virtue for the actors, and about caring relationships with the animals in question, and our own complicity in their predicament, and the feasibility of various welfare interventions, and the legitimacy of the social systems and political systems that we use to make these decisions. There will be all kinds of other factors that affect actual decisions, and it would be a mistake to think, if in the aggregate wild animal welfare is net positive, that means automatically we should start reforesting everything and throwing as many R selected insects and parasites into those environments as possible. And if we think wild animal welfare is net negative, it would likewise be a mistake to think, well, we know what to do then. We should immediately start paving over all of the forests and getting rid of those lives right here today. Or at least I think so. And I would expect that you do too. But you can, of course, correct me if your ethical stance is more provocative than I might be imagining. Okay, in any case, there are plenty of other questions. So on this topic, Oscar, and both of you, please do speak to this if you like. On the topic that you mentioned a moment ago of potentially having a greater capacity for suffering than happiness, you noted this is perhaps verifiable empirical reality, at least for some species like humans. Bonnie notes, even if we do have a greater capacity for suffering than happiness, and even if other animals do too, obviously how much welfare you have over the course of your life depends not just on your capacity, but on the realized amount of suffering and happiness. And even if we do have a greater capacity for suffering than happiness, we might still, because we actively pursue happiness, realize more happiness than suffering overall. So does the fact that welfare depends on what we realize, not just what we could realize, and that we actively seek out happiness, how much does that push back against the significance of a potentially greater capacity for suffering?
Okay, should I start then?
Yeah,
Yeah.
go for it.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I totally agree with that distinction. What I would say though is that if that asymmetry there exists, that somehow limits. First of all, it can limit like the range of experiences you can have, and there are going to be things out there that are going to make many animals to suffer terribly, while there are going to be other things that are going to make animals have pleasure. You know, and Heather was contrasting these two things at some point during her presentation. However, if your capacity for suffering is more significant, then it may well be that when we're talking about extreme experiences, the bad ones will outweigh the positive ones. And it's true that we and animals do our best to attain the good things in lives, the positive ones. Unfortunately, we often fail to succeed. And this is another very sad asymmetry about life, because pleasure for any of us is not taken for granted and is difficult to attain. Suffering, however, is very easy to attain. If I want suffering in my life, I can inflict it to me. Straight away, I can just bring something and just hurt my body. So it's true that while animals want to get pleasure, and avoid suffering, they face all these challenges, all these external factors that unfortunately constrain them and make them often unsuccessful.
Yeah, it is distressing that not only might we have a greater capacity for suffering than happiness, but it is much easier to very directly and intentionally get someone to their suffering capacity if you really want to. Whereas it is much harder and takes a lot more thought and a lot more care to get someone to their happiness capacity. Heather, any other thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that might be true at the extremes, but I certainly think that access to sources of mild pleasure is very, very easy as well. Like sort of the mild to moderate, like, if we think that just perceptual pleasures and, novel objects and seeing things and all those sorts of things. Yeah, I think it's not so difficult to get access to those, and those are things that animals might have a lot. But yeah, I think I do agree that it's very easy to get to the extremes of suffering compared to the extremes of pleasure. And so, yeah, from that point of view, if we see an asymmetry.
Great. Yeah, thank you. We now have a question from Anne, which I think is directly related to this one. Both of you have, for the most part, defaulted to discussing welfare in terms of subjective experiences like pleasure and pain and happiness and suffering. So in other words, experiences that feel like something and feel either good or bad. And then we can compare the goodness and badness in terms of intensity and duration of the positive or negative subjective experience. But as Anne points out, while we can take for granted that positive and negative balanced experience is at least one dimension of welfare or well-being, according to many theories, there are at the very least other dimensions too, and that might include the satisfaction or frustration of our desires or preferences as one prominent example. It might also include the extent to which we flourish in a species appropriate manner, or in other words, live a kind of species typical life or attain species typical goods. For humans, that might be knowledge and friendship and achievement. But for other animals, it might be different. It might be a certain type of socialization, a certain type of physical activity. And I guess one question would be, and this is me elaborating on Anne's question, which draws attention to this sort of foundational assumption. One question would be, how much of your argument does depend on a narrow focus on these hedonic states, these affective experiences? And if you do widen the scope of your investigation to include the satisfaction or frustration of desires or the attainment of species-specific goods of various kinds, then how might that affect your analysis? And either one, Heather, how about you start this time?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly, yeah, like I do have an explicit commitment here to a sort of hedonic state view of animal welfare. I think there are kind of lots of reasons to think that that's a plausible way to consider animal welfare, given the kinds of creatures they are, the kinds of things they have the capacity to value, and that, you know, the most plausible versions of these sort of other welfare theories applied to animals are probably taking these as instrumental goods that impact on hedonic states. So, you know, species typical goods are good because they typically like feel nice for the animal and their frustration feels bad. Same with preferences. But I guess taking the second part that, you know, if we were to move to one of those other theories and say that, look, it's non-instrumentally good for an animal to have its preference satisfied or for it to, you know, find these kind of natural goods, whatever they are, I think we'll see a lot of the same things come out, certainly on a preference satisfaction and frustration account. I think we're probably going to see most of the same things. You know, if we think that preferences and sort of, you know, hedonic liking and disliking are going to roughly track most of the time, that having the things you want is feeling good and having the things you don't want is feeling bad. And so I think, yeah, we're going to see that, you know, the number of preferences that animals do and don't have satisfied is probably going to be something like the same picture that we see from the hedonic one. I think the sort of more objectivistic, like teleological flourishing kinds of accounts are going to be more difficult. But these accounts run into, I think, real problems in trying to delineate which things count and which things don't without appealing to something else. You know, if we want to say, well, look, it's just flourishing as you've evolved to, then it's very unclear why, you know, getting a parasite and being eaten by a predator or any of those things aren't just part of kind of the natural life of the animal. And if you want to start saying, oh, well, those things don't count because they're clearly bad, then it's like, well, they're bad in virtue of what? And then whatever they're bad in virtue of starts to seem like the thing that's grounding your account of welfare, and it's starting to become instrumental. So I think, yeah, it's more difficult to get cases like that off the ground, and then very, very difficult to sort of start saying that any wild animals have better or worse lives under those sorts of accounts because they're all kind of fully natural.
Yeah, I think that is a pretty compelling consideration. Oscar?
Yeah, so I think I agree with Heather with regards to the preference satisfactionist account. I think that, yeah, overall it's going to be very similar to what we are going to agree on from an experientialist or a hedonist approach. As for objectivist views, I am less certain about that. I mean, there is an argument that can be built on there about the like the waste of life. You know, you bring into existence all these huge numbers of animals, and it's true that all of them lead natural lives. but they are all like frustrated in anything that really constitutes like the kind of good life for that animal. So for each animal that gets to have a good life, there may be thousands or millions or hundreds of millions that have their lives thwarted, and it's not that they can exercise their freedom or attain anything. So maybe, you know, I could use this to complement my argumentation. It may win more people to the kind of view I was arguing for. It just so happened that because I'm an experientialist, I mispronounced it, experientialist. That's a tough one. Um, I don't think that these things really matter, and so I wanted to focus on the other thing. But maybe from a strategic viewpoint, it was a mistake for me to not to consider.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
fair
maybe
enough.
there's a useful project there in just taking these other views of welfare and being like, hey, you don't have to be, you know, experientialists like us. You could be one of these other welfare theorists, but we should still think that there's lots of reasons to care about like intervening that wild animals might have bad lives or whatever.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see how it plays out for some of the other theories, since this one has been the focus of a lot of these discussions, and it makes sense why. But I think that could be a good area for seeing how robust the main arguments and conclusions are, to see whether they still hold for other sort of adjacent theories of welfare that are prominent in the literature, even if in your heart of hearts you feel pretty bound to the experientialist hedonist view. Okay, there is a really interesting exchange between Tristan and later Bonnie, where Tristan started off by noting that, you know, a lot of the discussion has so far been pretty qualitative, in the sense that you have pointed out considerations that might make suffering worse in some cases or happiness better in other cases, but there has not been all that much quantitative, except for Oscar's general observation that there are a bunch of R-selected animals who die young, and relatively few K-selected animals who have long and happy lives. And so Tristan asked, have there been attempts to make these types of arguments quantitatively and really use math to see what that reveals? There, of course, have been, and there has been an interesting arc for those sorts of arguments over the past 20 years or so. So I just first of all wanted to ask either of you if you have any reflections about the prospects, but also the sort of concerns that could be involved with using math to clarify the state of play about this kind of issue.
Yeah, so I think my big concern with it is just the number of assumptions that have to go into building a model like that right now, and the degree of uncertainty or lack of justification for like a lot of those background assumptions. So, you know, many of those models are essentially just assuming the kinds of things that we're sort of arguing for here as a baseline to create those numbers. But, you know, in order to do it quantitatively, we can get information on, you know, roughly how many animals there are of different types and those sorts of things. But, you know, we don't have numbers on what their experiences are like. We just don't have any idea for most of them, you know, how many positive or negative experiences they have, what the intensity of their pleasure and suffering is. And so any ways of doing quantitative modeling on this essentially just has to make a lot of assumptions about those things, which is kind of what we're wanting to find out in the first place.
Anything to add, Oscar?
Yeah, I agree. I think that we've used some extremely simplified models, but not really with the intention of, you know, claiming that that represents really exactly what's going on there, just as very broad heuristics to think about certain factors. And the fact is that this is not, at least right now or in the near future, something that I think that people working on this are going to be researching, because, as I mentioned before, these are more foundational questions, but priorities right now in wild animal welfare work are directed to, you know, directed elsewhere. You know, people are trying to develop, as I said, wild animal welfare assessment methods, try to identify you know, a feasible intervention that can be scaled up, that are net positive, and etc. So yeah, I don't think this is going to happen in the near future.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be the type of foundational issue that might shape understandings of the welfare of wild animals and the ethics of certain types of interventions in the long term, in terms of, for example, should we give over a part of human society back to the wild animals, and what would the net welfare effects of that act of generosity be? Or even more speculatively, should we one day terraform new planets so that they have entire planet-sized populations of wild animals, and we would be responsible for all of the good and all of the bad? And would that be net positive or net negative? Those are the kinds of long-term questions where this really could be a key consideration. But as you say, for short-term ethics and policy, it really is a matter of specific interventions designed to mitigate specific human-caused harms or improve specific types of experiences in specific populations, and will not really depend on this sort of issue. Now, Oscar, you mentioned the kind of research that people are doing. And as we come to the end of the session, I want to bring us back to a question from Jacob about that and pose it to both of you. I know both of you have been working on it, and Heather in particular has been working on indicators for wild animal welfare assessments. So Jacob notes both of you have emphasized the need for more research in this area. And so one part of the question might be, in a little bit more detail, what kind of research would you like to see that can both help us understand how to improve the welfare of wild animals, but then also make progress on this more foundational question about whether their welfare is mostly positive or mostly negative? And Jacob also asked, how can you even construct these indicators and do these assessments without the sort of biases that come along with our human perspective, like projecting human interests and needs and vulnerabilities onto other animals? So maybe, Heather, we can start with you on this one and go to Oscar.
Yeah, good. So certainly, like you mentioned, I've had a pretty strong interest in this idea of like, how do we measure wild animal welfare and what welfare indicators do we use? So I've been involved in a big project with some welfare specialists and people at the Wild Animal Initiative, where we've been trying to assess, a range of different welfare indicators that have come out of animal welfare science and evaluate how useful they might be in the wild animal context. But one of the upshots of this is essentially just seeing how few of these have been validated in the field and for the kinds of species that we need. Welfare indicators are most often species specific and they're context specific. And so there are a lot of things that have been developed for use in captivity for domesticated species that more work is needed to either, validate them for the wild or develop methods that can be used in a sort of non-invasive way for wild animals. And so for me, that is sort of the key research area in terms of getting more information here is just, how do we get these indicators? How do we get them out in the wild? And how do we encourage people to spend time looking at this? So this kind of area of wild animal welfare research, wild animal welfare science particularly, is, I think, a new one, and it's something that we need to get more people involved in. But this question, I guess, of how do we do so without anthropomorphic biases? I mean, that's, the big underlying question perhaps in the entirety of animal welfare science. And it's a difficult one. I think the main thing we can do is be aware of that risk. And, as we're doing the work we're doing, just be aware that this is something that can be sort of being projected from us as humans onto the animals, and making sure that we're protecting ourselves against it, that we're paying attention to, the animal form of life as an animal, to make sure that we're thinking about, what are the things that they communicate to us through their behaviors, through their body language, through their kind of lifestyles, the things that matter to them and the things that they respond to, and not the things that we as humans think are important because they're important to us. And so I guess, having humility and paying attention to what animals are like and how they live, I think is a really important part of this.
Great, thank you, Heather. Oscar?
Yeah, so just to add a couple of things to what Heather just said, I think there is a distinction between the success that has been attained thus far and that we can think that can, that we can have in the near future, and the plausibility of the work. As for the plausibility, I think that the very existence of animal welfare science and the fact that it has been, going on for already more than, since the mid 20th century, actually, several decades already, means that progress can be made here as well. It's just that there are challenges that you don't find when you are just considering only a few species and also in an environment that you have under total control and so forth. In addition to this, I think that it's not just work on welfare assessment methods that can help us here. We also need some sort of cross-disciplinary work. So cross-disciplinary work is like multidisciplinary work, but the difference with cross-disciplinary one is that you incorporate the work from many different disciplines, but assessing the results from the viewpoint, so to speak, of one of them. In this case, that discipline would be animal welfare science, but then you would consider contributions from ecology and other fields. And the interesting thing is that there is a lot of work that has been done already in these other areas that would be useful. It just so happened that the focus of that work has not been on welfare, has been on other things, because the purpose was anthropocentric or conservationist. But for instance, when you do some study about how some heat wave causes mortality in a certain population of birds, well, maybe you can infer things from there to a welfare analysis of the situation, because typically, not just because the process that leads to your death is going to be painful, but also because if in a certain population 20 of the animals die, that problem means that the others have had their welfare severely affected. So we can combine this kind of knowledge with the one that more specific welfare assessments in the tradition of animal welfare science can teach us.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both so much. We are now out of time, so we will have to stop it there, though I will note that there are a bunch of other really great questions and comments in the Q&A tab as well. We will be sending a document with all of the questions and comments to Heather and Oscar so that they can see them after the fact. This is not to say that they will be able to reply to them all, but they will at least be able to see them and think about them with appreciation for everybody who contributed to the conversation. And we will put this recorded talk online too, so that people can refer to it later. And just as a reminder, this was hosted by the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program. We sometimes have events that address foundational, important, difficult questions like this one. And then other times we have events about bird safe glass and wildlife corridors and these other maybe more short-term interventions that we could consider. So we can address a wide range of interconnected issues over the course of our many conversations. So thank you, first of all, to Audrey Becker for running the talk. Thank you for everything you did to make the event happen. And thank you especially to Heather and Oscar for having, I think, just a really productive and interesting conversation about a really, really difficult issue. I really, really enjoyed it, and I really, really appreciate your taking the time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It's been really great.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Have a great day, everybody.